This is Jennifer Bashaw, and we are starting Lecture 7 of Christianity 125. We have just finished the Lecture 6 on the writings that were wisdom, literature, and poetry, and we ended with Job, and the video cut off at the end, but I hope you heard me say that Job is the pinnacle of wisdom literature because it attempts to answer and also kind of helps us become okay with not answering some of the biggest questions in our world. You know, why do bad things happen to good people? How can a just God allow a world with so much evil? And though it doesn't answer it completely, it does help us understand how we can come to God with our confusion and problems and know that in the end we're not in control and we do not actually know the big picture view like God does. So moving on to our post-exilic literature, we're going to look briefly at Chronicles and Ezra and Nehemiah, and then look at the short stories of Esther, Ruth, and Daniel, and then end with the apocalyptic literature at the end of Daniel. So we've already looked at Deuteronomistic history. Remember when we looked at Judges and Joshua, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. All of these focus on history and the prophets, and that ends with exile. And these are written earlier. Well, chronistic history are the books that are written much later than these Deuteronomistic histories, but they cover some of the same events. So chronistic history focuses on this history of the people of Israel from the perspective of the temple and its priests. And so this takes us into the period of restoration. So we get many of the time periods that maybe we don't know much about from Deuteronomistic history in this chronistic history. Briefly, we're going to look at Ezra and Nehemiah. If you would like to look at the video on them, again, look at the slideshows I've posted, and then put it in slideshow mode and click on Ezra and Nehemiah, and you can see the Bible Project video on this. But chronistic history has to do with 1st and 2nd Chronicles, which are history books told from the perspective of the temple and its priests. So we see some of the same stories that we'll see in 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings, retold in a little different way. Ezra and Nehemiah are from the same perspective of 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Ezra and Nehemiah are not actually prophets. They're religious and civil leaders. Ezra is a priest and Nehemiah is a civil leader here during this time of restoration when the Jews have come back from exile and are trying to rebuild Jerusalem and the temple. Basically, they are concerned with this renewal of the covenant coming back into the promised land and the restoration of the temple in all its ways, both with the building and also with the presence of God coming back into the temple. We are going to move quickly through that. Ezra and Nehemiah are important in the history of Israel, but we have to move on with some of the other pieces of literature during this time period. And being someone who's very interested in literature, I love the short stories that are found in Esther, Ruth, and Daniel. And short story is a genre, and we've seen it before when we looked at the story of Joseph at the end of Genesis. That is really a short story. It's crafted in a way with some main ideas and themes, but very tight story that helps us understand, some of the bigger pictures, things going on in Genesis. So Esther and Ruth and the first chapters of Daniel do the same thing. These are brilliantly sculpted stories that help us understand things that are going on in the nation of Israel all throughout its history. So Esther is the first one we're going to look at. And Esther, the book of Esther is set during the time of exile or post-exile, actually. The Babylonians came in and of course destroyed Jerusalem and took many people out into exile, and they were in exile for a couple of generations. When Persia came in and defeated the Babylonian Empire, many Jews stayed in Persia. It was a good environment for many of them, and while there were several waves of exiles who went back to Jerusalem, there were also those who stayed in Babylon, which was now Persia, because it was their home. It was where they were born, and that was all that they knew. And so Esther is a story about someone who was here in captivity the city of Susa, which was the capital here of the Persian Empire. This was during the reign of Xerxes, which was 485 to 465 BCE. This is the only Old Testament book that takes place entirely in Persia, so outside of Israel. As you read through the story of Esther, you get several different themes that come up. Purposes. Basically, it's telling the story of this Jewish woman who becomes the queen of Persia. And it's a story of deception and intrigue and murder, and it's very many reversals. It's an exciting story to read, but in the end there are several things that the story is doing. One, it is talking about the life of Jews when they are not actually in their land, and how they can be faithful to their own God, even in the midst of an environment where no one else is serving God. And so you see that. But there's also a historical purpose. This talks about the time in history when the Persian government almost committed genocide against the Jews that were living there. But because of the courage of Esther and the faithfulness of Esther and her uncle, they end up being saved, the Jewish people. So several times throughout history we see the Jewish people persecuted and executed, but here we see that they are saved by the faithfulness of a woman and her family. And this explains the festival of Purim, which is a festival that Jews still celebrate, that commemorates the time when Esther saved the people of Israel from being killed, massacred in Persia. So there are several different themes going on here, but I encourage you, if you have time, to go back and watch the video on Esther from the Bible Project. Ruth is another short story. What's interesting about Ruth is, again, it was written post-exile, so it's a later book, but it is set during the time of the Judges. If you remember back then, the time when there was no king in Israel and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Here, it's set during this time period, and it talks about some interesting themes that are actually from the time period it was written, post-exile. So our assignment today is for you to read the book of Ruth. It is not that long. Go to the book of Ruth in the Bible, in your textbook, and read the chapters there. And as you're reading, list out some of the themes or teachings that come out in this book. So at this point, I'm going to ask you to pause the video to complete this assignment, and then come back and we'll talk a little bit more about some of the purposes of Ruth. So hopefully you have completed your assignment on the book of Ruth. I'm not going to give you all the answers here about the themes, but I will give you some of the overarching purposes here. Ruth does provide a biographical understanding of the lineage of King David, because Ruth marries Boaz, and they become the ancestors of David, the King David who's going to be born just a couple of generations later. So you get this piece of the puzzle in the story of Israel. Also, it teaches about the sovereignty of God, and how God is involved in this story. Even though God is kind of in the background, you see a lot of passive voice going on, that God is working out things for Ruth and Boaz in this story, and especially for Ruth's mother-in-law, Naomi. And then this also teaches us the importance of universalism in this time period, post-exile. The Jews now are scattered sort of everywhere. Some have come back to Jerusalem, some are in Persia. They're moving into different areas in the Mediterranean world, and they have to figure out what does it mean to be the people of God amongst people who do not worship God. And here we see Ruth, who is a Moabite, not an Israelite, come to understand God and come to love the people of God and become really a part of Israel's story, because she is one of the ancestors of David. And then also we'll find out in Matthew that she is in the lineage of Jesus as well. So this idea that not just Jews can know and understand the God of Israel, all people can. This is emphasis here in Ruth. It also emphasizes the importance of welcoming and befriending immigrants. Because Ruth, as an immigrant from Moab, at first faces some problems in Israel, but eventually we realize that she can worship God too and become a part of God's purposes being worked out in the world. The last book we're going to look at is the book of Daniel, which really sort of forms a bridge between the Old Testament themes and what's going to happen in the New Testament, because it covers a whole bunch of history in what we call the Second Temple period, the Second Temple that was rebuilt when the exiles come back to Jerusalem. We call this the Second Temple period, all the way up into 70 A.D. Or CE, when the Romans come and destroy that temple. So Daniel is in exile. He has been taken from Jerusalem, and he is in Babylon now, and his exile begins around 606, 605 BCE. He stayed there in Babylon and served under several kings until 537 BCE. It's interesting, we call Daniel by his Hebrew name, but his three friends, we call by their Babylonian name, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Belteshazzar was actually Daniel's Babylonian name, but we don't remember him that way. We use his Hebrew name. The style of literature is interesting here in Daniel. The first 6 chapters is a short story, just like Ruth and Esther, but the last chapters are apocalyptic literature. And apocalyptic literature is a literature that we'll see more of in the New Testament when we get to Revelation. But this is a symbolic, visionary type of literature that involves prophecy, but also makes use of a lot of metaphor and imagery that's difficult to understand when you're not reading it from the time period that it was written. This will also look forward to end times, so it will bring up themes that we'll see in Revelation as well, that talks about the end of time and God's purposes being fulfilled at the end of time. So briefly, you probably know some of these stories. The first story about Daniel is that he and his friends wanted to remain faithful to their God and their traditions, even though they were brought into Babylon and into the palace. And so they asked that they could remain faithful to their dietary laws and not eat the royal food and wine that they were supposed to eat in order to get big and strong and be great contributors to Babylonian society. So he asked, can we just eat vegetable and water and see how we do? And see if our God will help us get through this. And of course, you probably know what happens. They do very well, and so they are able to hold on to their faith and their practice in the midst of this foreign land, where they are now serving a different king, not serving Israel. The other very famous story is of the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. The king has made a statue, and he wants all people to bow down to it. Nebuchadnezzar, but the 3 men say, we cannot do this. We worship only our God. And they say, if we are thrown into the blazing furnace because we don't worship you, the God we serve is able to save us from it, and he will rescue us from our hand. But if he does not, we want you to know, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. So you see this example of faithfulness in the midst of foreign powers. And it's a very different picture than we see in Ruth, which is trying to show that different people from different cultures can worship God. Here it's trying to say, maybe you'll be in a situation where people will ask you to worship other gods, and you have to be faithful to that. And probably the most famous story is Daniel in the lion's den, where he prays to God and not to the king like he is supposed to, and his enemies get him thrown in the lion's den. And of course, he's rescued, and the people there praise Daniel's God because he saved him from the lion's den. The last part of Daniel, like I said, talks about apocalyptic visions, and it's really written like a dream diary or an autobiography of these visions. So when you read it, it's very difficult to understand. I encourage you to go watch the video for Bible Project if you're having problems kind of understanding these. But very exciting images to read and try to interpret. But the main themes of these images is really that God, in the end, will triumph over all evil and all nations. Nations become evil because they focus on war and on wealth. But basically it's saying that in the end, God will triumph over these evil nations. And God will help those who are serving God under foreign rule, because God in the end will eventually rule all.